Alien and Aliens are absolute classics of the horror genre. Actually, no, you know what? Not the horror genre, but cinema as a whole. Alien is one of the best horror films ever made, and Aliens is often considered not only one of the best sequels ever made, but also one of the best sci-fi action films ever made as well. Although I've always considered it action horror, but that's just me. Alien 3 is not as well thought of. This was unfortunately the first critical failure when compared to the previous two entries, and there are a lot of detractors. It does have its fans though, and for the most part I consider myself one of them, though it really does have a myriad of issues. There's a lot of problems. It was famous for its studio meddling, with Fox and director David Fincher constantly knocking heads, and the entire experience seemed particularly exhausting for him, to the point where he's never returned to record any audio commentary or even editing a director's cut, with the often praised assembly cut being the closest we'll ever get to that. I'm personally an assembly cut guy. I love the inclusions and it really feels as close to Fincher's vision as we're likely to ever get. But it wasn't just the film in production that had problems. There were multiple different scripts considered before the version we saw. One of these scripts was written by none other than sci-fi legend William Gibson, and I really quite like his proposed version of Alien 3. It has since gone on to be turned into an audio drama of sorts, which I've listened to, which stars Lance Henriksen and Michael Biehn. But also, there's a surprisingly good comic book miniseries by Dark Horse Comics, which I own. It's not perfect, but, you know, I actually really like the ideas within it, and, well, Alien Covenant borderline lifted certain ideas straight from it. Additionally, when editing this video, I discovered that there's been a novel adaptation of Gibson's script by Pat Cadigan. At least I think that's how you pronounce his name. So I'll probably be checking that out as well. There's also some other bizarre versions where it gets turned into this strange biomechanical virus that takes over a space station, another version that had a wooden planet. There's some really bizarre things. You should go and read them, they're quite interesting. Go and look them up on the wiki. But enough about that. This has absolutely no bearings on the video games, and that is what this video is covering. Today, I'm going to be looking at all of the video games based on the often maligned film. But before we begin, I'd like to point you in the direction of LV426, a fan remake of the Electric Dreams Aliens game that I covered in the previous video. This was created by Darbian? I don't know which one. Let's go with Darbian. This was created by Darbian Games, and not only updates the graphics and the HUD, but also includes quality of life changes such as incorporating a mini-map, which I really could have done with back on the original version. And what's really cool is that you can customize your 6-person squad with other Marines from the film. I've put a link in the description below, go and check it out, it's quite cool. Also, big thank you to Mark Raygun for bringing this to my attention. Well, shall we begin then? This is every video game adaptation of Alien 3. This version of Alien 3 was released on, well, practically everything in October of 1992. This was developed by Probe Software and published by Acclaim under the Arena Entertainment label. I won't be looking at all of the different ports of this game, as the only truly different versions were on the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy. We will be looking at both of them as well. This version of the game was released on the SEGA Mega Drive, the NES, the Master System, the Game Gear, Amiga, and Commodore 64. Can you see? This wasn't just Mattacus Finch hyperbole, it was on everything. The one we'll be looking at is the Mega Drive release, as I believe it is the superior version to play and is my personal preference. Plus, I actually owned it back in the day, and still do. So, graphics. This might be the best looking game we've looked at so far in this video series, if you don't count the Isolation DLC in the first video, of course. And the game world, I think, still looks pretty damn good, which helps build up a decent atmosphere. Character sprites are okay for the most part, with Ripley being the understandable standout. I think the Xenomorphs look a little goofy at times, especially when they're in that crawling position. Look at that little goofy grin.
Yeah, I'm gonna get you.
So what about the enemy variation? Well, as I said, there are the regular drones running around, but there are also eggs and facehuggers to contend with as well, but they go down relatively quick. They do a good job, and thankfully they always tend to stand out from the background to make it easier to spot them and then gun them down. In theory. Why in theory? Well, because they often leap out of the ground or sprint from off screen so quickly that it can be difficult to react, and the tracker doesn't really help all that much either. Plus, later on they take more damage to dispatch, which wouldn't be so bad, except that when you take damage, you get knocked down, and you just lay on the floor for about like a half a second too many, and then you get back up again. It's another in a long line of things the game does to stop you dead in your tracks and delay you, which in turn allows that timer at the top of the screen to drop even lower, frustratingly so. In most stages, a number of the Fury 161 inmates have found themselves cocooned, and if you don't save them within the allotted time limit, they'll have a bundle of joy bursting from their chests. Even when you save all of the prisoners, the timer still continues to count down. So you could have finally located the final bald chap, but can't get to the exit before the time expires, which means you need to do it all over again, and again, and again. It's bitterly frustrating and just elicited audible groans from me whenever this would happen. Sure, in the earlier stages you can learn the lay of the land and know where every inmate is being kept, but unfortunately some of these later stages can get pretty labyrinthine. It can quickly become more irritating than fun as well, which is a shame because it all runs at such a blistering and exciting pace when you're not falling on your ass constantly. Thankfully, you've got a good arsenal of weapons at your disposal to take down the hordes of xenomorphs. Ripley comes equipped with a pulse rifle, the underslung grenade launcher, a flamethrower, and hand grenades. Nothing fancy and no bigger pickups unfortunately like a smart gun, but these weapons all do the job and really feel like they're best suited for certain situations. Plus, the grenade launcher can be used to completely eradicate a door, which the xenomorphs can also do, which is a touch I always quite liked. There is limited ammunition in all of your weapons, but you can pick up additional ammunition throughout each stage, as well as health pickups and batteries for your tracker. There are 2 levels in the game that do things slightly different though. There's a stage in the assembly hall area where there are no enemies and you just have to sprint around and find all of the prisoners, which is surprisingly refreshing. And another stage in the communal area which sees the player having to make a straight dash for the exit as there are no prisoners, but the area is full of xenomorphs. This is probably one of my favourite stages. There's no stress of trying to navigate a maze-like area whilst finding cocoon prisoners, and instead you just have to gun down a bunch of enemies. Although that bloody timer is still there. I really think the game could have benefited from more variety like this. There are boss battles once you complete all of the stages in an area. These consist of xenomorph guardians and yeah, that's all. The only time the game mixes this up is by throwing 2 at you as a final boss. There's no queen, no dragon, just guardians. It's disappointing, and to make matters worse, these battles have time limits as well. There's always a bloody time limit. Maybe these timers are to represent Ripley's impending death by the queen in her chest? Actually, probably not considering how the game ends. The final boss fight might be one of the single most infuriating battles I've experienced in recent memory. Guardian 1 acts like all of the others have done in the past, but the one at the very bottom of the arena just keeps hopping back and forth, spraying acid. I lost count as to how many times I died trying to beat this. And what's even worse? Well, the final jump to reach the exit has to be timed just right, otherwise you'll find yourself falling to a platform below with no time to make a second attempt. It's really irritating. The ending is it's okay, I guess. It's non-canonical, of course, as Ripley survives her ordeal and just kind of pieces out of Fury 161. If anything, the game over screen is more keeping to the source material. With all that being said though, I think the absolute standout of the game is the music. I am a big fan of the work of Matt Furniss. I've loved his work on games such as The Terminator for Mega Drive and Fear Effect on PlayStation 1, which I covered recently. and this game is no exception. Like the environmental graphics, his music just further helps enhance the atmosphere the game is going for, with the track that plays during the leadwork section of the game in particular being an absolute fucking banger. Just listen to this. So good. I hate to say it though, in the end, I kind of just got frustrated with the level layouts and the strict time limits. So much so that I ended up using maps uploaded by John Brain over at GameFAQs. Hats off to you, mate. So, what about the locations Ripley ventures through? We start at the outdoors of the facility, then we go to the slaughterhouse, the dining room and communal area, the assembly hall, I think, a hive, and finally, the leadworks. All the areas look really good as well and very similar to their movie counterparts, as best as they could do given the hardware. Some of it might be a bit too light compared to the film, but if you couldn't see what you were doing, then this would become an absolute miserable chore. So how about the game as a complete package? Well, it's okay, I think. It's certainly entertaining in short bursts. It looks good, it runs at a good frantic pace, and the music is superb, but I really think it's hampered by the time limit placed in each stage. And it feels like all too many rooms and air vents are there specifically to slow you down and stop you from progressing, which makes the difficulty feel more artificial than balanced. It does add urgency for sure, but it can quickly become frustrating and I always eventually want to play something else as opposed to pushing on and finding every single prisoner, only to have to do it all again and again and again. And unfortunately there are times when you might as well just let yourself die when the timer reaches a certain point with prisoners remaining. That being said, there is fun to be had here, and I'd recommend giving it a go. Load up the level skip code so you can experience all the different stages, or use the walkthrough like I did. So all in all, it's okay, mixed bag. Alien 3 for the Super Nintendo was also released in 1992 and was once again developed by Probe Software and published by Acclaim under the LJN banner this time. This version is completely different from the other versions they made, with the only similarity being the setting and side-scrolling nature. Everything is different and everything looks different too. For this version, the developers went with a slower paced and more methodical game, with stages containing multiple missions that must be completed before exiting on to the next stage. Missions can consist from anything from clearing an area of eggs, welding doors shut, fixing fuse boxes, obtaining key items, or taking on larger xenomorphs that look like big versions of the dragon. In a neat touch, you can tackle these missions in any order you wish, which does aid in making the game feel somewhat non-linear, but only slightly, mind you. Visually, the game is pretty good for the most part, with areas looking genuinely murky, dank, and miserable, just like the source material. Ripley looks decent, and she's animated well and looks really, really good on the mission console. It's nothing fancy, but the game world does a good job of adapting the locations seen in the film. It looks like Fury 161. Unfortunately, some of the rooms you traverse are just too big and expansive. It makes the game world feel far too empty. I prefer the smaller rooms such as the alien corridors and the main hub. It makes me really miss the locations present in Probe's other offering. That all felt more claustrophobic in all the right ways. Here, coupled together with Ripley's slower movement speed, it just feels as though it can take longer than necessary to reach your destination or objective. The prisoners just chilling in the background of certain areas always just makes me chuckle though. It's nothing to worry about, lads, you know, there's just a xenomorph infestation, go back to your duties. It's even more amusing when they're in the same room as captured prisoners. You know what, I'm starting to think that actually now is as good a time as any to bring up the multiple liberties the devs took with the source material in these games, i.e., you know, Ripley having firearms and multiple xenomorphs. The story I've heard and read online is that Fox approached them to make a game to coincide with the release of the movie. They were given various versions of the script, you know, with details and whatnot for them to create the game in time. One of the folks that worked on the game went to go and see the film at the cinema and was mortified to discover how different the movie actually was. I can only imagine that awful, deep sinking feeling that they must have felt. Anyway, getting back to this game. In terms of weapons at her disposal, Ripley has most of the same weapons as the previous game, just minus the hand grenades, which means we have the pulse rifle, the grenade launcher, and the flamethrower. You can collect multiple magazines and grenades this time though, and not just one pickup that just maxes out your ammunition. Unfortunately, the pulse rifle just sounds so generic again. It did in the previous game as well. It's always bugged me incessantly. Still, the ammo counter is a really nice touch. You can also acquire better fuel for the flamethrower, with green and blue being stronger than the base version. And, thankfully, the motion tracker cannot run out of power, unlike in the last game, but it can only be shown when you're not firing one of your 3 weapons. But what about the wrong-uns you'll be gunning down with these firearms? Well, there are lots of different sizes of xenomorphs on show here, which is a massive improvement over the minuscule enemy types in the previous Probe version. Here, there are chestbursters, medium and large xenomorphs, and they all look really good as well, by the way. There are also overmorphs, which are what the eggs are actually called, and they seem to have an infinite amount of facehuggers within as well, and they also take far too long to destroy, and you can only attack them and damage them when they're open, which is just weird. Speaking of facehuggers, these things are everywhere. You will never want to see another one of these annoying shits ever again. Fury 161 is just crawling. Literally. Well, at least they all come in a multitude of colours, I suppose. But this just reminds me of all the different ones you could get with the Aliens toy lines back in the day. There are a few boss xenomorphs, although I use the term boss very loosely, referred to as alien mothers. They look pretty good as well and have some decent detail, but are also not as annoying as the Guardians from the previous game. The Queen, however, is present. Unfortunately, you never actually get to fight her, which is, for me, bitterly disappointing. Instead, you operate some machinery to push the bitch and send her plummeting into the leadworks, which is the plan Ripley and the prisoners came up with to deal with the dragon in the source material. It just would have been quite nice to have some kind of fight with her as opposed to this very stiff cutscene. Yeah, I suppose it's better than nothing. But what's really surprising is that the ending stays true to the source material, and Ripley sacrifices herself so that Wayne and Yutani cannot get their hands on the Queen. We'll just have to ignore all the roaming bastards around the facilities, so all in all, there's a good assortment of Gribblies to gun down, but the facehuggers in particular get very irritating very quickly. The music is not as heart-pumping and adrenaline-fueled as the previous version, but it's pretty good, it's okay. It's the tracks here they're going for more ambience, and it complements the drizzly and unhospitable locations strewn throughout the game world, I think. Some tracks can grate at times, but the music can not only be situational, depending on whether there's enemies present or not, but it changes from mission to mission, which is quite nice. This is not a short game though, and some playthroughs online go for longer than 3 hours, and those are speedruns. So definitely use those passwords if playing on original hardware, or use save states if emulating. Thankfully, the passwords are only 8 characters long, which is genuinely really nice. The greatest issue I personally have of this entry is I found it became very tiresome very quickly, and I couldn't bring myself to see it through to the end without the password system. It's a shame as well because I quite like the non-linear approach to stages, and the mission structure as a whole is genuinely good. The controls are responsive for the most part, and gunning down enemies, bar facehuggers, can be rather fun, but it just runs out of steam very quickly for me. I think I prefer the other version that Probe Software created. I still dislike the timer present in that other iteration, mind you, but if the movement was a little quicker, this could have been more exciting. I completely understand what they were going for. They wanted to make a slower paced and tense game that felt more like the source material in a sense, but for me it's just too slow and unfortunately repetitive for me. The missions all eventually blend together and you can only repair X amount of fuse boxes so many times before it gets a little monotonous. It does have a great game over screen though.
Game over, man.
The later levels ramp up the difficulty by making the hub and the connecting rooms more confusing and labyrinthine, and xenomorphs take even more gunpowder to dispatch than before, which is fine, but due to the gameplay style and the ever-increasing number of facehuggers and eggs, it just means you're constantly stopping and starting. It just drags everything out for far longer than it needs to, in my opinion. It really harms the flow. And I found myself getting increasingly frustrated with this entry as I continued to play it. It got to a point where I audibly just said, nope, put the controller down and played the next entry on this list, which, again, is such a shame. Because despite my shortcomings with the game, overall I was initially enjoying the first stages before the fatigue began to sink in midway through stage 2. And to put that into perspective, there are 6 stages in total, so that should tell you everything. That's not to say it's bad or terrible though, it's still a pretty good game if played in short bursts. I think if they combined the non-linear mission structure of this game with the fast-paced and frenetic action of the previous version, then that would be one hell of a game. But if you've liked what you've seen, then you should absolutely give this one a try as well. I just hope you find more enjoyment than I did when I was recording footage. And I feel really bad for feeling this way as well, because there's a lot here that I really do like. And it's the longest entry I've covered for this series so far as well. This is the only home version not developed by Probe Software. The Game Boy entry was made by Bits Studio and plays completely different to the previous 2 games. Where the others were side-scrolling action games, the handheld version is more akin to an overhead adventure title. You can pick up and drop items and weaponry whilst trying to keep prisoners alive, torching eggs in hives, and combating the wandering xenomorphs, facehuggers, and even a queen. It did take me a while to figure out that you pick up items by moving over these little blobs or crates and hitting select to see what you can, well, see.
Alright, let's see what we can see.
Since there are multiple xenomorphs again, you'll need some weapons to fight them, and that little cow prod you find at the start of the game just isn't going to cut it, I'm afraid. Well, luckily enough, the player is able to find a pistol, a pulse rifle, and a smart gun, with ammo aplenty for all weapons. You do also find a flamethrower as well, but that only seems to be useful for destroying eggs within a hive, and seems to do no damage to other gribblies. What's weird is that the flamethrower is found in an armory. An armory. On a prison. A prison that has no guards. Right, so in this timeline, in this universe, does the warden just ask them nicely not to blowtorch their way in and start shooting each other? It's a bit mad, isn't it? Well, it's a problem every single video game tie-in had. There are no real weapons in the film, and there's only one xenomorph, so yeah, of course they had to get creative. And you know what? Thinking about it, they should have just made an adaptation of Aliens. Can you imagine a 16-bit side-scroller based on Aliens? Oh, that'd have been so awesome. And you know what, thinking about it, I think perhaps something more akin to a point-and-click adventure game would have worked better for Alien 3. Anyway, graphically, it looks decent enough and does the job, utilising the limitations of the Game Boy relatively well to create different looking environments that look about as close to the film as they could have gotten. The character portraits are pretty good as well, with Ripley and Dylan looking the best, whereas Andrews just looks like his face is deflating. The facehuggers look okay, and the xenomorphs look pretty decent too. The prisoners running around look very basic, but this is understandable given the hardware, and they managed to stand out amongst the enemies too. I just wish you could talk to them, or if you can, I was unable to figure out how to do it. When I recorded the gameplay for this game, I was relatively quite ill at the time, and I was very, very, very tired. And when my eyes began to sort of glaze over, and I was looking at Ripley, she just began to look more and more like RoboCop, which just got like this sleep-deprived chuckle from me. Like, give me a break, okay? The music was driving me mad, and I was ill as well, okay? The weirdest thing is that the thing that will kill you most, not the facehuggers, not the drones, or even the warriors, hell, not even the Queen. It's the sodding fans in the air ducts. I must have died about 6 or 7 times as I was sucked into a fan and turned into mulch. One air duct later in the game is a particular chore to get through, as you have to turn some fans off, turn others on, then you have to reverse which way they're blowing or sucking. It's so annoying. You've got 3 tries, and then that's your lot. And when you die, you don't respawn at the beginning of that screen or area. You respawn all the way back at the quarters from the very beginning of the game, so if you've gone to one of the later areas, you need to make your way there all over again. Thankfully, you do keep all of your equipment. It's a one and done experience, so these ducks get very annoying very quickly. Thank God for save states. The sound design is decent, but the music itself is pretty monotonous, and you'll hear mostly one track for the majority of the game. I have no idea how you'd complete this without a guide back in the day. As to encounter the final boss, the Queen Xenomorph, you need to clear all of the eggs from 5 different hives, and then wipe out all of the facehuggers on level 1, all the drones on level 2, and all of the warriors on level 3. And I must have missed something because enemies just kept respawning and I had no indication whether what I was doing had any effect at all, so I just looked up the ending myself on YouTube. I looked at long plays. Like the Super Nintendo version, the Queen is pushed into the leadworks by machinery, before Ripley nabs Bishop and escapes from Fury 161 using the EEV, which is weird because it kind of looked damaged from the in-game sprite. Weird. Unfortunately, this is my least favourite entry in this video. It's not terrible, but it just runs out of steam very, very, very quickly, which is saying something because this is not a long game. Eventually, it just felt like a chore to play through, mostly due to those bleeding air vents. The minor adventure game elements at the beginning of the game just disappear partway through, which made it feel more like a missed opportunity for me. I can't hate it too much though. Again, this was on the Game Boy, and it could have been far worse. If you fancy giving it a go, definitely get a walkthrough ready. Otherwise, you'll get lost and frustrated very, very quickly. In 1993, arcades received Alien 3, The Gun. No, that's what it's really called. Developed by SEGA. Oh, SEGA. And like every other game on this list, all manner of liberties were taken with the source material. But this is absolutely chaotic as well, and in all of the right ways. Unfortunately for me, I've never actually seen one of these out in the wild, and I've only ever been able to play it through emulation. I really hope that one day I get to lay eyes on the cabinet at least. Look at this! It's very much of its era in terms of aesthetics, but I really like the inclusion of stuff like the Weyland-Yutani logo. It's so cool! One day I want to get my hands on the real hardware. One day. So, you get to play as Ellen Ripley again, right? Well, no actually you don't. It's a 2-player game and both players take the role of 2 unnamed colonial marines, who are part of a crew sent to investigate the Sulaco before descending to the prison planet of Fury 161, which has been overrun by xenomorphs. And then it hit me. I don't think this is just outright taking liberties such as the previous entries in this video. I think, maybe, just maybe, this might be more of a what if. What if the Queen in Ripley burst from her successfully, and the dragon was able to protect it until it matured and was able to produce eggs? Because the facility would have quickly become overrun. It doesn't explain why Bishop 2 doesn't show up until later, but, you know, or a whole heap of other things. I could just be talking bollocks, it's just an arcade shooter, who cares, right? Look, listen, it's just a fun idea for an arcade shooter, okay? I absolutely love how this game looks visually. It's a Sega arcade game, so you should always expect good things, at least in terms of the visuals. It also seems to be one of those super scalers the company was synonymous with back in the day. The enemies all scale really nicely, but more importantly, they all look brilliant. The digitized look really works here, and every facehugger and xenomorph has a great amount of detail, all with decent animation as well. You won't just be fighting the usual Gribblies, but also sentry turrets and drones, androids and synthetics, although the latter just look weird to me, like, why are they blue? Now, what was really weird was that my capture software would, at random, just stop displaying both the health bar and the weapon crosshair. It wasn't always on the same stage either, which was the strangest thing. There's likely a setting in MAME that I needed to tinker with, but I don't really have a vast amount of knowledge with MAME, I'm afraid. Anyway, all of the environments look absolutely ace as well, from the halls of the Sulaco, the stormy surface of the planet, the mines, the canteen area, and the leadworks. The music and sound design is, as expected from Sega, absolutely fantastic, with a few musical tracks in particular really getting the blood pumping. It all fits the game perfectly in its blistering pace. Coupled with the great sounding weapons and the screams from the facehuggers and xenomorphs, it makes for a wonderfully chaotic experience. The Colonial Marines though, the ones you play as, they sound so goofy, I love them to bits. Yeah, sounds great, music's great, sure, it looks good. How's it play? It's a rail shooter, so there's not really a great deal of depth to the game. You point the crosshairs where an enemy is, and you press the fire button, and that's it really. It's what you'd expect, and there's nothing wrong with that either. Although, you can't just hold down the trigger constantly or run out of ammo very quickly. Well, you'll run out of charge anyway.
Remember, short controlled bursts.
During the adventure, there are grenades that can be acquired, and these clear a screen of enemies and do a lot of damage to bosses, and you can also pick up flame units that make quick work of most enemies. Now, one thing that genuinely really surprised me is that for an arcade shooter, for an arcade rail shooter, it's quite forgiving. Perhaps I found it easier because I was using a mouse to aim and fire as opposed to the actual hardware itself, but even still there are plenty of health items and pickups strewn throughout each stage. And the bosses aren't painfully broken either. This all makes for a genuinely fun and exciting arcade experience. Speaking of bosses, we've got a decent assortment here. There's a large facehugger, which I'm assuming is supposed to be the super or royal facehugger from the film that was only seen in the assembly cut. It's this big thing on... An old military tank robot thing, an adult xenomorph, the dragon, and Bishop 2. Nothing groundbreaking, but each boss does the job, I think. Still feels weird that there's no queen, though. They showed great restraint in that regard. They showed really good restraint in that regard. What's cool though is that the second time you encounter the dragon, you have to force it into the molten lead before dousing it with cold water, just like the film. It's really cool. Also, the music for this fight is really good. The game actually has multiple paths as well. Okay, I say multiple paths. I only found one different path. When you enter the main facility, you're faced with an elevator and can decide where you want to go. This decision not only changes the enemies you encounter for the rest of the stage, bar the boss, but also the environment as well. It's not much, but it does add a small modicum of replayability. What might surprise you is that the runner isn't actually the final boss of the game. The final boss is actually the unidentified man, who is listed as Bishop 2 in the film's credits, with later tie-in material naming him as Michael Bishop Wayland, which is odd, not only because you just assume a xenomorph of some sort would be the final boss, but also because it actually sort of makes sense in a way. In the film, the dragon or runner is killed and then Bishop turns up. And you could argue he's the closest thing to a human antagonist similar to Burke in the previous film, even though his screen time is pretty short. But it's also odd since the game takes all of the liberties it can, bar having an appearance by the Queen. Either way, it's still a genuinely good fight, and he might be one of the easier boss fights in the game. All in all, this is some great mindless fun and exactly the type of thing that you'd be hoping for from a company like SEGA, especially with a rail shooter. I'd absolutely recommend loading this up now on MAME and going on a personal bug hunt. I had an utter blast recording the footage for this video. And you know what? I'll likely go and play it again later on down the line, maybe even after I've recorded this. Now, all I have to do is just find the physical unit out in the wild. That's all I need to do. That's all I want. I just want to find it. Oh, one day. And with that, our time with Alien 3 has come to an end. I feel we certainly got more substantial quality this time around. All four games have some serious strengths with a few weaknesses strewn throughout. My favourite game on this list is hands down the arcade shooter by SEGA, with the Mega Drive version in second place despite its myriad of issues, and the Game Boy version probably at the bottom of the pile due to frustrations I had with it. Which means that the Super Nintendo version is it's the okay one. It's third place, not last. Despite my problems with these games, all of them do have some good moments, and I think are definitely worth playing if you're a fan of the series. But, again, the gun is the standout here and just a superb, mindless and fun experience from beginning to end. It really is that good. Unfortunately, the next two videos in this series might take some considerable time to come out, as going forward, most of the games I'll be looking at will take me some substantial time to play through. games such as Alien Isolation, Fireteam, Colonial Marines, Descent, which I only just recently bought and haven't actually played yet, so that will be my first playthrough potentially. And that's not to mention all the games for the video after that. It's going to be quite the undertaking, and the next 2 videos are going to be much longer in length, I think. Luckily for all of you, I made an entire video covering Alien Resurrection on the PlayStation 1 back when I was still known as Lost in the Warp Pipe. So hopefully that will tide you over. Plus, I'll be working on a whole slew of other content as well. I want to be taking a look at Metal Gear Solid 1, I want to take a look at some horror games. I've got some cool stuff in the pipeline that I'm quite excited about. But until then, take care, and I'll see all of you when we go on another bug hunt in the future. Take it easy.